Good evening. Welcome to our history, theology, philosophy lecture series. I'm John Hamer. I'm streaming to you live from Toronto Centre Place. After a bit of a hiatus in our series, I have been traveling, as we'll talk about in this lecture tonight. Spent a little over a week and a half in the Middle East, and then after that I was attending a meeting of the Canadian Council of Churches, where I also reported some of what we observed in the Middle East. We're very happy to be back here and lecturing again. And Leandro is with me. He is monitoring your chats in the live stream. We're going to mention that tonight's topic can be charged in a partisan sense, and we are not interested in having trolls come and blindside everyone. So don't feed trolls, and if you are kind of trolling, you'll be warned and you may have to get booted. This is a live interactive presentation, and we will have a Q&A after the formal lecture. I'm going to be referencing whole bunches of other lectures that we've given previously. And so you can always find those at our website, centerplace.ca/lectures. They're also on YouTube and Facebook, but it's much more difficult to search and locate them there, I find, than if you just order by topic in our website. The lectures, of course, are listener supported. We really appreciate the contributions that folks have been making in order to allow us to focus on producing more of these. You can always do that at centerplace.ca/donate, and you can also do that as a super chat in the YouTube window, and that also lets us highlight your comment or quote. So we appreciate all of that. Our topic tonight is Christian Zionism, and I'm going to be talking, it's actually a wide-ranging topic, and in some ways, as when we approach something like this that is also controversial, we begin with sort of the context of Christian Zionism, and probably could have another lecture on the nitty-gritty of it, but we'll see where we get tonight. So I was recently at a historic site known as the American Colony, which is just outside of the old city of Jaffa and has now been enveloped by the new city of Tel Aviv. This picture here is a historic hotel in the American Colony, and this was visited by Mark Twain on a round-the-world trip he took in 1866 as he was writing the book Innocents Abroad, which is, I think, his best-selling nonfiction book. So Mark Twain says in his travels, when he goes to the Holy Land, he says, "I'm forgetting the Jaffa colonists. At Jaffa, we had taken on board some 40 members of a very celebrated community. They were male and female, babies, young boys, young girls, young married people, and some who had passed a shade beyond the prime of life. I refer to the Adams Jaffa colony," what's now called the American Colony or American German Colony. So Mark Twain says, "Other members of this colony had previously deserted it. We left in Jaffa Mr. Adams, his wife, and 15 unfortunates who had not only no money, but did not know where to turn or whither to go. Such was the statement made to us. Our 40, the ones who were leaving the colony and coming back on the boat with Mark Twain, were miserable enough in the first place, and they lay about the decks, seasick all the voyage, which about completed their misery, I take it. However, 1 or 2 young men remained upright, and by constant persecution we wormed out of them some little information. They gave it reluctantly and in a very fragmentary condition, for, having been shamefully humbugged by their prophet. They felt humiliated and unhappy. In such circumstances, people do not like to talk. The colony was a complete fiasco. I have already said that such as could get away did so from time to time. The prophet, Adams, once an actor, then several other things, afterward a Mormon and a missionary, always an adventurer, remains at Jaffa with his handful of sorrowful subjects. The 40 we brought away with us were chiefly destitute, though not all of them. They wished to get to Egypt. What might become of them then, they did not know and probably did not care. Anything to get away from the hated Jaffa. They had so little to hope for, because after many appeals to their sympathies of New England, made by strangers of Boston through the newspapers, and after the establishment of an office there for the reception of moneyed contributions for the Jaffa colonists, only $1 was subscribed. So nobody in New England was going to help these guys get home. The Consul General for Egypt showed me the newspaper paragraph which mentioned the circumstance and mentioned also the discontinuance of the effort and the closing of the office. It was evident that practical New England was not sorry to be rid of such visionaries as these colonists, and was not in the least inclined to hire anybody to bring them back to New England. Still, to get to Egypt was something in the eyes of the unfortunate colonists, hopeless at the prospect seemed of getting any further. Thus circumstanced, they landed at Alexandria from our ship. One of the 4-hour passengers, Mr. Moses Beach of the New York Sun, inquired of the Consul General what it would cost to send these people to their home in Maine by way of Liverpool, and he said $1,500 in gold would do it. And so Mr. Beach gave his check for the money, and so the troubles of the Jaffa colonists were at an end. So this is a little story that Mark Twain tells of the end or the failure of a very peculiar colony of members of a church from Maine who had established an American colony next to Jaffa in what was then the Ottoman Empire. So one of the first sites that I visited when I got to the Levant, when I got to Tel Aviv, is the Maine Friendship House in the historic American colony. And this was built by members of the Church of the Messiah in 1866 near the old city of Jaffa. This church, as Mark Twain mentioned, was led by a prophet named George J. Adams. Adams was part of the Restoration tradition, the Latter-day Saint movement. He had previously served in the first presidency of the Mormon prophet James Stray Strang. But he founded his own church in Maine. And part of the idea of the church was to restore all things. And one of the things that they specifically had a vision to restore was to restore the Jewish people to Judea. And so they assembled, they pre-cut all this lumber, made prefabricated houses, which they assembled along with modern agricultural equipment, modern for the middle of the 19th century, which they hired on a tall sailing vessel and made their way all the way from Maine to the ancient port of Jaffa and the Levant, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. The colonists actually got the U.S. Secretary of State, Seward, the guy who was famous for buying Alaska from the Russians, Seward's Folly. Seward wrote to the Ottoman emperor, the sultan, that asking for permission. Permission actually then was not granted, although they started building the colony through different means anyway, without that kind of a direct permission. The goal that they had was to make a model colony to show that old Palestine could be using modern agricultural equipment, could be farmed. And they built, like I say, a whole bunch of houses that would have been very suited to Maine in order to be there. Unfortunately for them, the Middle East has very different conditions both in terms of climate and otherwise. And so their farming and all of their know-how, everything that they brought, their seeds, largely failed. And so they were very naive in founding their colony. And as Mark Twain explained, it eventually became something of a fiasco, especially also as George J. Adams proved to not be a very good leader. And as folks eventually made their way back to Maine, many of them were ultimately gathered into my church, the Community of Christ. So we have this sort of background and part in this story of Christian Zionism, a small part, but kind of an influential early part of the story. All right, so I want to talk a little bit of, giving a little bit of context of the present day crises that's happening in the Middle East, specifically in Gaza. So the Gaza Strip is a very tiny place. It's 365 square kilometers or 141 square miles, a little more than half the size of the area of the city of Toronto's city limits. There's some 2.3 million people, a little bit fewer now, who live in the enclave, making it one of the most densely settled territories on the planet. And Gaza, the Gaza Strip, along with Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem and the Israeli-occupied West Bank of Palestine, constitute sort of the remaining territories of Palestine. The Israeli military has enforced a complete air, land, and sea blockade of Gaza since 2007. So prior to 2023, numerous human rights groups observed that that blockade had had the effect of making Gaza into, quote, an open-air prison. So the Gazans are not able to get in or out or freely trade, and are instead just simply kept there. And in response to that blockade and other issues, on October 7th of last year, the Palestinian militant group Hamas broke out of the enclave, attacked Israelis in a horrific terrorist attack, killing some 373 members of the Israeli security forces, along with 695 Israeli civilians, including 38 children, and another 71 foreign nationals. So very major attacks against civilian population in addition to military targets. The militants, in addition, took as hostages a further 251 Israeli civilians and soldiers. The civilians included 30 children, and of those hostages, 4 were released by Hamas unilaterally, 105 were released as part of a prisoner exchange with the Israeli government. Israel holds in prison large numbers of Palestinians, including children, and so some of these were swapped. And then to date, the Israeli military has rescued 8 additional hostages alive and has reclaimed the bodies of another 34. So some other hostages remain held, and others have probably already died or been killed. So since October of last year, then, Israel has conducted an unprecedented military operation in Gaza that has resulted in at least the direct killing of 43,000 Palestinians, including 17,000 children. In addition, there's just the wholesale destruction of everything within the territory. So there's been damage or just complete destruction to 80% of Gaza's housing, 80% of its commercial facilities, 87% of its schools, 100% of its universities, 68% of its road networks. So every institution of higher learning, for example, has been totally destroyed, including, in this case here, this is just a willful detonation where the university is deliberately leveled. So in addition to the number of Palestinians killed directly by the Israeli military, the Israeli operation in Gaza, and Israel's refusal to allow in humanitarian aid has resulted in a human-made famine, according to UN officials. And the Brown University's Watson Institute for International Affairs suggests that at minimum, the famine in Gaza has already resulted in another 60,000 or more deaths, mostly of children from starvation, and thousands more also from preventable diseases, chronic diseases that you would normally be able to get treatment for, which treatment is not available. And so by far and away, the bulk of the population of Gaza is now experiencing at least a crisis level of food. Many are experiencing, tens of thousands are experiencing a food emergency, and many more are actually in total famine conditions. So, enacting collective punishment against the civilian population, systematically denying humanitarian aid, using famine as a weapon of war, these all constitute war crimes. And so earlier this month, the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with his defense minister, for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I didn't go to Gaza on this trip. It's impossible or very difficult and very dangerous to do that. Instead, we went to East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So while Palestinians in the West Bank are not facing the same degree of catastrophe as those in Gaza, the ongoing military occupation there, which has been ongoing for the last 7 decades, has resulted this last year in at least 794 deaths, including 167 children killed. And that's just simply in addition to countless numbers of people imprisoned, Palestinians imprisoned without charges. There is a general denial of freedom of movement, since, as you can kind of see in the map here of the West Bank, Palestinian towns and cities are there in the kind of dark brown, and they're all surrounded by this sort of purple area, which is controlled by the Israeli military, including the ability to close off checkpoints to deny freedom of movement between any of the different enclaves. In the meantime, also ongoing through the last many, many decades are, if you can look at the map here, all of the dark purple areas. And so this is the construction of new Israeli settlements on land seized from the Palestinians. And this also, building on occupied lands by the military occupier, is against the Fourth Geneva Convention. And so that's also a war crime. So my trip to Palestine and Israel. So my church, Community of Christ, is a member of Churches for Middle East Peace. And this is a Christian ecumenical organization. And it sponsored an awareness and advocacy trip. And it was also the sponsor for a Palestinian Christian Women's Summit, the And Still We Rise Summit, which took place this month. I participated as one of my church's representatives, and so we met with both Palestinian officials and Israeli officials. We met with leaders of Christian churches in the Holy Land, and we also met with leaders of Palestinian NGOs and leaders of Israeli NGOs that are committed to being part of a peace process if such a process reemerges. One of the most memorable events occurred in Bethlehem, where members of our group, the Churches for Middle East Peace group, had dinner with leaders of the Palestinian Christian community, including, some of the very top leaders, the Latin or Roman Catholic Archbishop of Jerusalem, top leaders of the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox Church, the different Protestant churches in Palestine. A lot of times people don't think about the fact that while they're a minority, a proportion of the Palestinian population are Christian and also are part of a population of Christians whose presence there date all the way back to Byzantine Roman times and, according to their tradition, all the way back to the biblical times, the times of Jesus is their traditional understanding. So in meeting with these leaders, there was we were sort of present for an intergenerational conversation where the oldest members were still trying to hold out hope. The kind of middle-aged members were talking about the fact that so many of their children were at this point wanting to just leave because they don't have any hope and therefore immigrate to the West. And even then, some of the youngest Christians were saying, why should I stay? This is where there is not any hope seemingly on the horizon for anything other than living in an enclave that without freedom of motion, without jobs, without economy, that where you're subject to arbitrary arrest and harassment and so forth. And so it was pretty amazing to be able to be part of that. And one of the leaders really challenged all of us by saying that really the Palestinian Christians felt like they had been completely forgotten and betrayed by Western Christian leaders. And so many expressed really a lot of difficulty. Your role as leader of a spiritual community in part is to try to bring hope to people in your community, and many expressed that this was becoming increasingly difficult since their own well of hope felt like it was run quite dry. So I'm going to go from this recent context to deeper context. We're visiting here. You can see us in front of a gate to the Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem. So this is a camp established for refugees of originally of the 1948 Arab Israel War, where people have been living ever since. The key on the gate here is a symbol that represents the keys that the refugees took with them when their houses were and property was expropriated by the Israelis after that war, and their memory and desire to return to those homes. And this refugee camp is also noteworthy for being the most tear-gassed place per capita on Earth, I guess. And so they've also taken the pellets from the tear gas cans and other things to make artwork as well. So given the cycles of violence in the Middle East, I think it's very difficult to summarize kind of current events without talking about, prior provocations and escalations. And so my goal in this presentation is to look at the role that Christians, especially in other words, Western Christians, not local Christians, including members of my own movement, as we talked about here, as Mark Twain talked about, have played in the past, in part with good intentions, but also naively, and not always intentions that have continued to be, I think, justifiable in more recent years, with the hope then of moving towards some kind of future with peace, with justice for people of all the religions and non-adherents as well. So here's that city of Jaffa. It's pictured in the 1860s. So on the Levantine coast of what was then the Ottoman Empire, Jaffa has now been enveloped by the Israeli city of Tel Aviv. So the American colony that I've talked about founded was just outside, very close outside of the old walls here of the ancient or old city of Jaffa, and then Tel Aviv was built next to that. So I want to try to dissect some terminology. And again, some of this is going to be very charged. And so I want to, a lot of times everything gets glommed together. And as a result, each one of these terms maybe gets thrown around. And I want to kind of look at some of these. So starting with terms and background, what do we mean by things like the kingdom of Israel, Israelites, Samaria, Samaritan, Judahite, Judean, Jewish, and so forth. So, as we've talked about in several lectures, the ancient kingdom of Israel emerged during the Iron Age from the surrounding Canaanite culture under monarchs who were centralizing their rule at successive capitals in those that included cities like Shechem and Samaria. And so as a result of the association with this capital Samaria, it's often called the Kingdom of Samaria. And so around the year 720 BC, this kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, who deported thousands of nobles to the Assyrian heartland or area north of there. And as one is wont to do when you have these kind of empires, you also bring additional settlers back. Some of the Israelite exiles, in addition, fled south to the kingdom of Judah, but the bulk of the population always in these kind of cases remains there. So it's generally speaking that nobody takes all the peasants away. So when this period of time that's called the lost 10 tribes, referring to the northern 10 tribes, we've had a lecture on this, that in fact refers to the loss of elites who were brought away to another part of the Assyrian Empire and ultimately assimilated into Assyria. So they're lost in the sense that they lost their individualized identity, not in the sense that they're hiding somewhere in the Northland or in the center of the earth or some other place like that. So like I say, some of those Israelite exiles fled south to the kingdom of Judah, which maintained an autonomy as a tributary or client state of the Assyrian Empire. So as we've talked about, we've had lectures both on the lost tribes and also on the Samaritans. One of the heirs to that ancient northern kingdom are Palestinian group that has continued to live in that area, unbroken continuity since then, the Samaritans. Samaritans now primarily live in their numbers are greatly reduced, and they now live primarily in two communities, one of which is just outside of Nablus, which is a new Arabic way of saying Neapolis, the new city that is right next to ancient Shechem and Samaria in that same area. And so they live in the community of Kiryat Lusa there, and are Palestinian Israeli citizens who speak Levantine Arabic. And then the other surviving group of Samaritans have moved to a neighborhood in Tel Aviv, Holon, where they are Palestinian Israelis, what Israel prefers to call Arab Israelis, Samaritans. So I mentioned that the kingdom of Judah continued to exist. It had been Israel's poorer, more sparsely settled neighbor, but after Israel was incorporated into the Assyrian Empire, you can kind of see these are provinces in the darker green of the Assyrian Empire, whose heartland is off in northern Iraq, northern Mesopotamia. But the Israel kingdom, Samaria itself, becomes a province, as does then Megiddo and Gilead, which are other components of the kingdom that are now different Assyrian provinces. And then you can see also that the Philistine and Phoenician coast is also incorporated into the Assyrian Empire, with two of the Phoenician city-states anyway, nominally autonomous, the Tyrians and the Phoenicians from Byblos. So the kingdom of Judah then, though, as a client of the Assyrian Empire, began to grow and prosper. And so this is when in the ancient world, Jerusalem starts actually growing and becoming important. And this is when we start to have the first components of Bible writers who are starting the beginning of what becomes the Bible. So the kingdom of Jerusalem, the kingdom of Judah, benefited from receiving Israelite exiles and also from the increased trade that was now present because of the Assyrian commercial system. So one of the things that they wrote about were their identity narratives. Where did we come from as a people? And this includes the source texts of what became Genesis. So there's multiple different source texts, or there's the earliest text that is added onto, depending on how we understand the development of Genesis and the rest of the Torah. And so part of that is the idea that the kingdom of Israel had an eponymous ancestor who was named Israel, and the Bible gives him, or equates him with Jacob. And so they're saying that that patriarch Jacob had his name changed to Israel, and that he becomes the eponymous ancestor of that people. And in a story that is told in Genesis, chapter 29, 30, and 35, Israel has two wives, Leah and Rachel, and then two concubines. And between those four women has 12, it's 12 sons, but then let's see, one of them gets replaced as a tribe, and then Joseph, the favored sons, two sons become tribes. So in other words, and each one of those is then the eponymous ancestor of one of the tribes. And so actually what has happened is there had been these tribal locations, and actually there were more tribes than this, but these 12 got identified, and these 12 were identified as being Israel and Judah. And so the Bible writers are writing, creating eponymous ancestors for tribal groups that had existed. So they're writing after the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the authors of the Bible, who in the first instance are writing in the court of Judah, the court of Jerusalem, or potentially they're writing later as exiles, living in Babylon, but again being patronized by princes who were from the royal house of David. They then created stories about eponymous ancestors for Judahite and Israelite tribal groups, and they picked 12 because that's a magic number in order to compose a shared mythic identity that goes back into the deep past. So biblical authors writing under the patronage of Judah's kings and or their princely successors in exile in Babylon also told stories about the eponymous ancestor of those kings. And so the kings of Jerusalem, the kings of Judah, they were known as sons of David or people of the house of David. And so that may or may not have been derived from a historical ancestor. It's very likely that it was. There was an ancestor at some point named David, the same way that the Merovingian kings looked back to an eponymous ancestor called Merovich. Whether or not anything is known about him as a historical figure, later legends were created about him. And in the same way, courtly stories were written about David and a united kingdom of Israel that he ruled over, which are now understood to be literary. And so we talked about this. I have had a lecture in the on who was David, and we've had another couple of things. But I am going to have another full lecture where we are talking about the the legendary United Kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon, because we routinely get asked about this. I don't want to spend too much time on this here, but I promise a full lecture on that and the evidence for that archaeologically. So, again, around 586 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire conquered the kingdom of Judah and deported many of its Judahite nobles to Babylon. And then when Persia conquered Babylon, the Persian emperor Cyrus the Great allowed some of those Judahite exiles to return to Jerusalem, rebuild their temple there, and to administer the city as the capital of a new Persian province called Yehud. And then in turn, when Alexander the Great of Macedonia conquered the Persian Empire, the province became contested by his successors, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, before very briefly achieving independence of itself under the Hasmonean kings or the Maccabees between the years 129 and 63 BCE. Okay, so that kind of gets us through Israel, Israelite, Samaria, Samaritan. I want to talk a little bit about Judahite, Judean, Jewish, Hebrew, those words. So the English word Jew is derived from the Hebrew Yehudi. I'm going to get a drink of water here and maybe cough. So the English word Jew is derived from the Hebrew word Yehudi, and Yehudi here is also the source for Judah and Judahite. We always have this thing in the English Bible where English translators of the Old Testament, since they're translating from Hebrew, they take sort of Hebrew sounding versions of in creating English place names or English personal names, whereas when they're translating the New Testament, they're translating it from Greek, and so then they use kind of Greek sounding names. And so that's why when we're reading the Old Testament, it talks about Judah and Judahites and that kind of thing, whereas in Greek, the Greek version of this same word is Judaios, and the Latin is Judaius, and so that gives us Judean, and so that's why in the New Testament the same place is called Judea and Judeans. And we have the same thing that happens with names. So there's the eponymous ancestor of the Judeans or the Judahites is a guy named Judah, which in the New Testament, because it goes through Greek, is rendered either Jude, like the book of Jude written by, supposedly anyway, the brother of Jude, the brother of James, the brother of Jesus. But we also have Judas, which is, again, the same name as Judah, but it's just, again, going through Greek. So in New Testament texts, and then at the time even in antiquity, there was no verbal distinction in Greek and Latin between somebody who's from Judea, the land, and a member of the religion. What we would say, we now I think fairly clearly use the word Jew to describe somebody who is either religiously or maybe culturally part of the religion, whereas we would call Judean somebody in antiquity who was living in let's say the Hasmonean kingdom or the kingdom of the Maccabees. So in that way, even though in antiquity large percentages of the Jewish population did not actually live in the land of Judea, they actually lived in diaspora communities, like, for example, the enormous and influential community in Greek Alexandria. They would have had the same name. They would have been called Judeans, even though they hadn't been in Judea for a long time, most of them. So also in between that, so that's Jew and Judean. Ancient Hebrew then consists, is the language spoken by the Judeans originally, and it consists of regional dialects of the Canaanite languages that were spoken by the Israelites and Judahites. And the language it was actually very, very similar to the languages of their neighbors who lived in Phoenicia, who lived in the coast, who lived in Moab and Edom and so on, all the surrounding areas of the West Semitic languages. So before the fall of Judah, before the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, Hebrew was written in the Paleo-Hebrew writing system, which is derived from and largely similar to the alphabet used by the Phoenicians. And so this image here of a calendar from the 10th century BCE, scholars are divided as to whether it's written in Phoenician or whether it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, because they're both largely the same. So while the Samaritans have continued to use a script that is derived from Paleo-Hebrew for their own Torah, for their own writing, the returning exiles, the exiles that have been in Babylon, took one of the state languages of the Persian Empire, Aramaic, and took that alphabet that was being used for Aramaic for writing Hebrew. And over time, also Aramaic displaced Hebrew as the common tongue spoken in their province in antiquity. So ancient Hebrew was maintained as a liturgical language, which then began to be revived as a spoken language in the 19th century, although it continues now to be written in Aramaic script. So that's sort of those. Then we also have what is Israel and State of Israel. So the State of Israel unilaterally declared its independence, its establishment in 1948, after the failure of a UN plan to partition the territory of mandatory Palestine, so Palestine on this side of the Jordan, as opposed to Transjordanian Palestine, now what we call Jordan. Mandatory Palestine had been governed by the British Empire, whose mandate expired, and they were in the process of having so much of, they were broke after World War II, and so much of their empire was collapsing. They did not want to put fight a whole war in it to separate the Palestinians and there were the Muslims and the Jews that were in Palestine, and so they pulled out. After the newly declared state defeated a coalition of all of the Arab neighbors who were also mostly recently made independent after World War II in the 1948 war, the State of Israel was admitted to the United Nations in 1949, where it is recognized today by 164 of the 192 member states. So a lot of recognition still not given by Arab especially, but also other Muslim states. So although I think it's common for many Jews to equate the religious idea of Israel that is mentioned and expressed in the Bible with the modern state of Israel, obviously that's a relatively new interpretation since the state has only been in existence since the middle of the 20th century. For most of the history of Rabbinic Judaism being Second Temple Judaism, one of its very principal heirs, the religion has been lived in diaspora, which is to say most of the members have not lived in the land. And under these circumstances, when people are thinking about Israel, they are on the one hand thinking of a land that was lost, that they would like to return to, but they also think of Israel in the sense of all of the Jewish people in exile. So we've also mentioned that the Samaritans are a second heir of ancient Israel, and the religious idea of, and to a religious idea of Israel. And of course, there remains another significant heir to Second Temple Judaism that has its own interpretation, that is the Christian community. So Christianity began as a sect of Second Temple Judaism and continues to be one of its heirs. The Apostle Paul, for example, identified himself as an ethnic Israelite in his letter to the Romans. So he writes to them as he's talking about his now new disagreement with his co-religionists. He says, I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means, he says. I am an Israelite myself, descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. But having established his bona fides and his ancestry and background, Paul argues that the true meaning of Israel is to be understood as a people committed to God, and it's not about ethnicity in his opinion. So he says, not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. In other words, it's not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. There's a saying attributed to John the Baptist in the Christian Gospels that God can raise up stones and make them children of Abraham. So it's not about ethnicity, at least as far as Christian understanding of it, which is rooted in, again, a faction of Second Temple Jewish Universalist thought. So Paul gives an analogy of Israel as an olive tree, and he says, some of the branches have been broken off, and you, all of you, people who aren't ethnically Israelite, though you guys are wild olive shoots, you've been grafted in among the others, and now you're sharing in the same nourishing sap that is flowing from the root of that old tree. And so I mention this because it was interesting. I was listening to a Palestinian Christian who was talking about kind of the disconnect that he felt as a Christian in Palestine, where the Bible in many places talks about praying for Israel, and Israel was a tormentor, as he saw it, in his life. And so, I guess what I want to say is that this is within the Abrahamic religions a contested idea, because there is a biblical idea, and then there is also, which has different expressions, and now there is a very physical expression that members of the Jewish community have planted. So I want to also look at Philistia, Philistine, Palestina, Palestine, Palestinian, Arab, and Arabic, what some of these mean. So Philistia is an ancient territory according to the Bible. The Bible locates the Philistines in the southwest coastal plain. One of their city-states was Gaza. So archaeology and modern history, we had a whole lecture, who were the Philistines? So that they have identified the Philistines with the Sea Peoples as the most likely original origin story for them. The Sea Peoples who invaded Egypt somewhere from the west, so maybe related to the Mycenaean civilization, the Proto-Ancient Greek civilization that was collapsing at this time during the general period of the Bronze Age collapse, invading the Nile Delta, but fought off by the Egyptians, who were one of the few civilizations that were able to hold out against the invaders, and who then potentially settled these invaders in the Levantine coastal region just outside of Egypt that had previously been part of Egypt's empire. That may well be the case. We've been able to reconstruct that from archaeology and from Egyptian records and so forth. That said, that history had already been forgotten by the time we have our first authors of the Bible who are writing. And so that isn't part of their collective memory. And in fact, they, in writing their origin story for the tribes of Israel, creating the Exodus story and so forth, they assumed that the Philistines had been present in the land prior to the arrival of the Israelites. It's probably, again, not the case. Most likely what archaeology and linguistic and cultural other evidence shows us is the Israelites emerged out of the background Canaanite population and did not come as a result of any great exodus of, say, slaves from Egypt that created a destruction layer where they killed everybody or anything like that. Instead, it's a identity that emerged and later created that backstory of the Exodus. So although the biblical depiction of the Philistine giant Goliath seems reminiscent of a Homeric hero, which indicates that the Philistines, if they do have that kind of background with Mycenaeans or maybe ongoing connections of some kind with the Greek civilization, by the time the biblical story is composed, the Philistines seem to have adopted the languages, the customs, even the gods of their Canaanite neighbors. And this is the kind of thing that happens a lot of times with conquerors. So the Franks who conquered Gaul didn't continue speaking a Germanic language. Instead, they over time started speaking a Romance language, the local language of the Romans that they conquered, which becomes French. And same thing, the Visigothic conquerors of Spain, their language is lost because they conquered in small numbers, and they ended up assimilating into the Romance language, the larger Roman population that they had conquered, those kind of languages. And so the same thing seems to have happened to the Philistines, who adopted the Canaanite language that would have been very similar to what the Judahites were speaking, Hebrew. Although the Bible creates, like I say, competing origin stories for the Israelites, they appeared very related to these Canaanite neighbors, and they would have been related to the Philistines in bulk, not the conquering few that assimilated, but the conquered people that were beneath the Philistines. So the name Philistia in Latin became Palestina, and that has been applied to portions of the Levant from before biblical times, and the name Palestina continued to be known in the Hellenistic period. So this area is being called that by the Seleucids, the other Greeks that are around there. When that area gets incorporated into the Roman Empire, there's that brief period of time when the Hasmonean kingdom of Judea is now an independent state and is controlling that. And so that becomes a client kingdom of Judea under Herod, under the Romans. And so when the Romans later incorporate that client kingdom into their empire as a province, Judea becomes the general name for the province. And it's only after the Romans have fought several wars with the Judeans, the first one which resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and the second one, the Bar Kokhba revolt, resulted in mass deportation by the Romans of any Judeans continuing to live. Then the Romans decided, well, we're going to wipe Judea off the map, and so they renamed their province Syria Palestina. But that doesn't mean that the name Palestine originated with the Romans. Both names had been present. The Romans simply changed which one of the two names that they were making the name for their province. The Romans often renamed provinces. All right, Arabs and Arabic. So the number of Arabs who migrated to the newly conquered provinces, Palestine and so forth, was also relatively small compared to the existing population. So over time, the bulk of the population of Roman Palestine and Syria, however, ceased speaking the language that they had spoken, which was, some of them spoke Greek, and some of them spoke Syriac, which is the medieval version of Aramaic. And over time, the majority population adopted Arabic, and the majority also converted from Christianity to Islam, although small numbers of Palestinians continued to be Jewish, also Samaritan, and a larger number, but still small, continued to be Christian. Okay. While spoken Arabic has spread to many nations. So Islam came out of the desert, conquered all sorts of territories, and so now there are different dialects you can kind of see. Distinct peoples continued to exist. So it's not as though the Egyptians were all killed off and replaced by Arabs. Rather, small numbers of Arabs conquered Egypt. The population, which had been Christian and spoke Coptic, now slowly over time converted. Still 10% of Egyptians today are Christian, and they also began speaking an Egyptian version of Arabic. So in other words, just because Arabic spread, that doesn't mean that all of the people in all these places are 100% Arab and they displaced all the previous populations. Rather, there's a difference between Arabian Peninsula, Arabs, Egyptian, Levantine, Moroccan, and so forth. So now, by way of additional context for Zionism, I want to talk about the ideas of nationalism, colonialism, imperialism. So nationalism is an idea that argues that a nation, so it's different from a country. A country is land, a nation is a people. So a nation, which is defined as an ethnic group, and it's often sharing a language, custom, religions. This is coming from the 19th century too, so it's usually about race. There's all kinds of racist ideas in the 19th century, that a nation should then be congruent with a state. So if you're going to have a country called France, it should be filled with French people, and it should be governed for the benefit of French people. And so the idea of nationalism is often dated to the French Revolution, and that certainly is an era when it became especially popularized and dominant, and spread, for example, with Napoleon and revolutionary armies all across Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. It became a dominant idea. So nationalism went hand in hand with European states that were modernizing, and it allowed them to create large, relatively homogeneous shared identities. One of the ways it would tend to do that is by creating, distorting history and creating nationalist myths. So an example, just an egregious example of like a nationalist myth is the movie Braveheart, where it's creating this story about Scotland and Scottish freedom, which is not really what was going on in this particular event with William Wallace. Certainly, a friend of mine who is from Scotland who maybe has all kinds of wonderful reasons to hate the English. The idea that the English exercised the right of prima nocta is not one of those reasons, since that's entirely a myth. So it's a nationalist myth. And so these kinds of identity stories, which are kind of rooted in, meant to be history, but are a little bit of a distortion of actual history, or maybe sometimes an outright distortion of actual history, are used to create this homogeneous identity. But this is also often done at the expense of minority ethnic groups or racial groups or religious groups whose languages and customs are, generally speaking, suppressed in the new nation state or in the nation state, and whose members may face all kinds of serious discrimination. And so, if France is now determined to become a nation state, one of the things that it will have done is take the people who are speaking this Brythonic language, this Celtic language of Breton, living in Brittany. They've been part of the Kingdom of France all this time, but now that language is going to be suppressed in schools so that everyone will have to learn French, and not just any French, but the French of Paris. And so in the same way, all of the regional dialects will get bulldozed as the nation state is meant to be homogenized. And this occurs in the backdrop in Europe as also kind of after the wars of religion, where there's a great sorting out between Catholics and Protestants. But it also then ends up causing very bad outcomes for other religious and ethnic minorities within these nation states. So while France and countries of Western Europe may have been relatively homogenous ethnically in the 19th century and easier to make into nation states, this was less true the more you went east. And so there were great states like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the Austrian rulers represented only a tiny minority, the German speakers, who were spread all around. And then even the Hungarians, again, were also just a minority, and there were all kinds of other different nationalities, the different Slavic nationalities, Italians and others that are in that empire, along with, of course, ethnic groups that don't have additional nations like Jews and Romani. Same way, the Ottoman Empire included multiple ethnic groups that had been intermingled since time immemorial. So it's hard to do maps of this, and so this one is meant to be a map of Turkey at its present-day boundaries of potentially what kind of the different ethnic groups might have existed as of 1914, before Turkey's attempt to have its own independence after being partitioned by the Western powers, after the Ottoman Empire was partitioned by the Western powers, which unfortunately resulted in big population transfers between Greece and Turkey, and also notable genocides like the Armenians, and ongoing issues like in the southeast there for the Kurds to this day. So population exchanges were very frequent through this entire time period, causing incredible suffering, and this whole period of it especially wrapped up in the aftermath of World War II. Nationalism, this whole idea of nationalism, wanting to have nation states, wanting to have your nation state challenge the other nation states, had been a major cause of the world wars, and it led to these population exchanges, what we would now call ethnic cleansing of states, as large numbers of each group are transferred west after Germany's defeat in that war. Nationalism is also a root ideology that was used to justify the Holocaust itself in World War II. That is to say, killing ethnic and religious minorities that the nation's dominant ethnic, racial, religious group defined as alien to the nation. So in this case, over 6 million Jews, another 250,000 or more of the Romani people, called gypsies at the time, and other groups that were seen to be deviant by the nation state, so homosexuals and so on. So, in big picture, I think we've seen nationalism has problems. The nationalism ultimately is not a great ideology, and indeed, even all of these nation states in Europe that purge themselves or ethnically cleanse themselves down to being, let's say, a country largely like France filled with French people or Germany filled with German people. Then you have the additional problem then when people migrate, let's say Turkish immigrants move to Germany, and 4 or 5 generations later, you're still sort of an alien within the state, since being German means something as an ethnicity, a thing that you potentially are not, even though you might be a full citizen and that kind of a thing. And so this is just an issue with the whole idea of nationalism and nation states. In addition to nationalism, a second major focus of European powers in the 19th and early 20th centuries is imperialism, modern imperialism. So the nations of Europe fought to expand their overseas dominions all around the world. The leader of this, or the one that kind of won the most, is the British Empire, on which the sun never set. And so this is a map of British dominions and colonies. And you can see all the outposts of empire everywhere, including, kind of the vast dominions in India and so forth. But other empires included Russia, which expanded not by sea, but by land all across East Asia to the Pacific that way, and encompassed all sorts of peoples along the way that are then essentially colonized by the imperial power. The European powers established empires, and it's not just Europeans, so the US also got into the act by colonizing places like the Philippines. Japan also did as well, colonizing Korea and so on. So the established empires, and they were interested in ruling territory, usually with the goal of, for example, controlling international markets. So you wanted your manufacturing interests to have a place to sell your goods, but they were also focused on extracting resources from those imperial territories. And so, for example, the continent of Africa, as it was divided here in 1914, with borders drawn by the European powers that had almost nothing to do with any ethnic groups or anything else on the ground. It also then, the imperial powers began building infrastructure, which is primarily designed to pinpoint a resource, pinpoint a port. How can you get a railway from that resource to the port so that the resource can make it back to Europe? And so one of Africa's legacies of this, in addition to just these crazy borders that are not helpful, are infrastructure that largely does not serve to connect the countries, but rather are designed with this completely different interest in mind. So although colonialism is related to imperialism, so all of these territories of the British Empire are called colonies, in general, there's a distinction between colonialism and imperialism in the more general kind of imperialism. So, like I say, the imperialism is conquer, rule, extract resources, and so on. Colonialism is attempting to plant a colony of your nation in the land which you tend to declare is vacant, even though it wasn't vacant, as you displace and often directly kill the indigenous inhabitants of that land. And so, for example, despite the very long rule of the British in India, relatively few Britons permanently settled in India. That wasn't the goal, but this contrasts with the colonialism that European powers had in North and South America, South Africa, New Zealand, and so on. And the United States and Canada are examples of colonial and settler nations. There's a picture here called American Progress from the late 19th century, where this giant lady here, who's a personification of the United States, she is leading everybody west. She's being followed by pioneers and cowboys and stagecoaches, and the native Americans are fleeing before this onslaught as they're being swept aside, along with the buffaloes. So this is these ideas, these 19th century ideas of nationalism, colonialism, and imperialism are the immediate context for the idea of Zionism. And so I want to talk also about the idea of Zionism, but also the terms Semite and the term anti-Semitic. So the word Semitic or Semite, and also the word anti-Semitic, which is where we hear of it mostly these days. We talk still about Semitic languages, but anti-Semitic is I think the most frequent use of this. It derives from the character of Shem, who in the book of Genesis is one of the sons of Noah. So since the story of Noah indicates that humankind is entirely wiped out in the flood, the author of Genesis then proposes that all the world's peoples have to then be descended from one of Noah's three sons. So the sons are Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And so the Bible identifies Shem then as Abraham's sixth great-grandfather. So Abraham and his descendants, that include both the descendants of Isaac, who is the father of Jacob, who is Israel. So in other words, the Israelites, and according to the biblical lineage, but also the descendants of Ishmael, who are the Bedouins, who are understood to be the Arabs. So Shem, anyway, is the lineage for both, according to the Bible, for both Jews and Arabs. And so if we take the kind of names of the different peoples that are listed in Genesis, and also the three sons, they're divided roughly into these kind of categories. And so, like I say, although the Judites and Israelites were actually related to the Canaanites, their lineage connects them instead with the Syrians and Mesopotamians. So the descendants of Shem are found over there, which is one of the origin stories. In other words, that Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees. He comes from that territory and then comes into the land of Canaan, which had been inhabited by the descendants of Noah's other son. And then finally, the furthest afield of the sons is Japheth. And so one of the other issues is that the Bible then talks about Canaan and his descendants that include the Egyptians as being descendants of Ham, who, according to the Noah story, is cursed. So God's favored people here are coming from the descendants of Shem. So biblical literalism mixed with 19th century racial bias in order to argue that Shem then is the ancestor of Middle Eastern peoples, including Arabs and Jews, and hence we have that Semitic family of languages that includes Arabic and Hebrew. People in the 19th century then identified Japheth with the ancestor of both Europeans and seemingly East Asians, and then said or stated that this cursed son, Ham, is the ancestor of Africans. And so the language Hamitic was originally a proposed language group that's based on this essentially biblical, but also kind of 19th century racial or racist literalist reading. And so I just got this, this picture is actually from an brand new AI generated image from another YouTube channel that is still dispensing this kind of lore as if this had anything to it. In other words, as if this was not just a pop and very negative idea that people made up in the 17th and 18th, 19th century. Okay, nowadays though, the word anti-Semitism, despite the fact that identifying people as Semitic originated in a context that I think was racially based. So we don't actually use these categories of Semitic and Hamitic and Japhetic anymore in the same way that we, don't follow this 19th century idea of dividing the world's races into Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. These are all kind of terms that are very discredited. So despite the fact that Semitic comes from that context, and that it also technically refers to any ethnically Semitic person, so Arabs, Jews, people from Malta. Nevertheless, the real meaning now of anti-Semitism has come to mean bigotry against Jewish people and often against Judaism generally. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism has a long and very tragic history in Christianity, in particular in the West as well, outside of Christianity, but also around the world in different places. The pagan Romans fought some pretty, very serious wars against ancient Judeans, and both destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, and also depopulated the province of Jews and didn't allow people to come back. Ancient Christians, despite emerging as originally as a sect of Judaism, because of the birth and division of the religion, so when Christianity at the end of the first century has become its own world religion that is distinct and no longer considers itself to be Jewish, or at least most of the members don't, they now start defining the people who are very similar to them or have been very similar to them in very negative ways. And so unfortunately, many of the New Testament writings themselves have very negative stereotypes about the Christians' former co-religionists, the Jews, and those then have been used or have been used as precedents for Christians all the way up to the present day to be anti-Semitic. It's often said that actually under Islam, Jews were actually usually did better, and that's generally true. There was a teaching within Islam that people of the book, Christians and Jews and others, are supposed to not be persecuted by Muslims, but are allowed to live in peace as long as they provide certain rules. They can't build new churches. Christians aren't allowed to ring their bells all day long for Sunday services. That's annoying to everybody, so you're not allowed to do it. You have to pay a tax and so forth. And that's generally true, but there are also periods within medieval Islam and so on when rulers would also decide to persecute everybody and have massacres and so on. So in general, it's always been very, very dangerous to be let's say a tiny minority within a much larger state, especially one who has a religion that is related but is often very, very antagonistic. And that's unfortunately been the case. So many proponents of Zionism, however, and people who are, let's say, supporters of the current government of Israel and its policies, many people incorrectly claim, make a blanket statement that any critique at all of the idea of Zionism or of the state of Israel or its policies, that any criticism at all, that just makes you anti-Semitic. And I think that this proposition just obviously falls on its face, since there's now a physically existent reality of the state of Israel, and no state actor can hold itself entirely above criticism. Everybody and all states, all governments are able to be criticized because they have policies that one can look at against international law or other criteria, and therefore evaluate and critique such state actors. And I think this is also true for the idea of Zionism. So Zionism, like any other ideology, like, for example, nationalism, which I've just been pretty down on. Nationalism can be examined in its historical context, and it can be reconsidered in the present. We are all heirs of it. In other words, everything that our present existence is based on the fact that we've gone through this nationalist period. And the same is true for modern Zionism, the idea of Zionism, which emerged in that context. So what is Zion? So I've said before that Zion as a word is a synecdoche. And so that's to say a part for the whole. So Zion initially in the Bible is a name for one of the hills in Jerusalem. It probably is originally identified with the Palestinian, what's now the Palestinian town of Silwan, which is a little hill that is immediately south of the old city, as it's now called, of Jerusalem. But this would have been the older part originally in ancient times. So that initially may be what was the hill that was Zion. But the place name has actually moved. And so now in the current city of Jerusalem, the western hill that's also south of the old city is now where, the present day maps called Mount Zion. And this is a picture of a Catholic abbey on top of the hill that's now called Mount Zion. But regardless of where the original hill Zion was, it's like the movement of Calabria, and Italy has those two, the heel and the toe of the boot. Calabria initially existed in Roman times in the heel, and then it moved to the toe. So anyway, names sometimes move. But poetically, the word Zion is used in the Bible as a general synonym for Jerusalem. So it's a shorter way of saying Jerusalem, just calling the city Zion. And then sometimes for the land as a whole. So Zion refers to the whole land, not just poetically, not just the city of Jerusalem, its capital. And then it's also connected especially with the idea of a restored Jerusalem. And so again, much of the Bible is written by or people who are composed or added to by people who are exiled or who then are now living in a diaspora. And so they are looking forward to a restoration. And this version of it definitely includes the idea that it's apocalyptic. So as the Second Temple period moves on, Second Temple Judaism has some sects, including the Essenes and the Pharisees, that are anticipating a literal end to the world, the coming of a Messiah or two. In the case of the Essenes, they're talking about two different ones. The Christians, of course, are also apocalypticists, and who think that when God intervenes in history and causes this unjust world to end, there will be a new Jerusalem where everything will be just and perfect. And that's sometimes then also especially called Zion. So Christianity wasn't initially Zionist the way we now think of the term. So Christians, so for example, at the time of the Crusades, the Crusaders were not thinking, boy, at some point or other before the end of the world, all the Jews are going to have to return to the Holy Land, and then they'll all embrace Christianity, and then God will come, and Jesus will return, and that will be the end of the world. That wasn't on their list. So in fact, actually, they killed Jews in Jerusalem when they got there, and many Crusaders unfortunately killed Jews along the way in Europe. Or the local people especially did that because they weren't able to get there. So there's a renewed focus on the Bible after the Protestant Reformation or during the Protestant Reformation, as now the technology existed in the form of the printing press for people, Christians in general, to now have easy access to the Bible, which is also translated into the vernacular languages, including English. And so this led Puritans to, let's say, read the Bible a lot more than Christians had ever done previously. Regular Christians in the pews, or they weren't pews, but regular Christians, were not, that was not the central part of their practice until this time. And so this also caused Protestants to read the Old Testament a lot more. And so as a result, there became some Judaizing of Protestant Christianity. And so this is where all of these kind of Old Testament names start to be used a lot more by Protestant Christians. And so the reason why we have people like named Abraham Lincoln, that name wouldn't have been commonly used by Christians in the Middle Ages, but now Abraham is something that the Protestant Christians are recovering as they're reading more about the Old Testament. And then this also gives them the idea that ahead of time, ahead of the end of the world, which they all believe is imminent, there needs to be a restoration. And among those things that need to be restored is that the Jews need to go back to Judea, need to be gathered back to Judea. And certainly President John Adams in the United States talked about that as an ideal. He thought that that if that happened, then they would all slowly kind of evolve into being Unitarians like him. Usually almost all of the people who envision this kind of a restoration before the end times, that will also be punctuated by all the Jews who gather converting to Christianity. And this is their idealized idea of what will happen in the future. And then that in turn will herald the coming apocalypse and the end of the world. So that idea of restorationism is the immediate context of the members of the Latter-day Saint movement under their prophet George J. Adams, who assembled their little colony with all of their prefabricated wood and tools and got on a boat from Maine and came to Jaffa with the idea of establishing a model colony in order to prove that it was doable and also to sort of trigger, the end times. Their goal was to have all things be restored, but they're part of a movement that is willing to, help all these prophecies along in order to get them moving. And as Mark Twain pointed out, they were innocents abroad. They were a little naive in their ideas, both that they didn't realize, the different climate, what things would be like in the Middle East, which is very different climate, very different agricultural conditions than Maine, and conditions even for how wood houses are able to survive. And so in that sense, their colony sort of failed, and they also were naive in terms of their idea of taking American colonialism and becoming settlers and colonizing Palestine. Because again, while their mission had the idea of maybe it would be a good thing for Jews who were suffering terrible persecutions and pogroms in Europe if they could have a place of refuge, and so there was a good intention there, that nevertheless no thought at all, we can say retrospectively, was given to the people that were already living there, the Palestinians. And so that has been part of the consequence ever since. Nevertheless, their activity and the fact that they made this colony, this was observed by Jewish thinkers in Europe in contemporary times. And so that also informed them and their later Zionist activities. So Zion I talked about as being a biblical word, and as a biblical word, it therefore has competing interpretations. It's a contested term. So I mentioned that the founders of my own church were apocalyptic literalists. They hoped to build actually a city of Zion, and they wanted to locate it in the center of the North American continent. So in the center of the North American continent at Independence, Missouri, which is a suburb of Kansas City. And that, they believed, would inaugurate Christ's millennial reign, which they were absolutely confident would happen in the 19th century. But as their heirs, even though we look back and we don't believe that kind of literalism anymore, we do still use the word Zion to refer to programs or just communities where we're trying to increase peace and justice. And so, for example, here in Toronto, our social housing charity is called Sionito, which is Spanish for a little Zion, because we began that in order to house refugees from South America and Central America who were fleeing, coming into Canada, fleeing political oppression there in the 1970s and beyond. And we also have, for example, our main campground that is a couple hours outside of the city here, which is called Ziontario, where we're trying to experience, a just and peaceable spiritual retreat. And so that's a pun with the fact that it's in Ontario. So in other words, we still think of Zion here in Community of Christ in Canada. And of course, our cousins in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons in Utah, have that same tradition originally of building a New Jerusalem or Zion in Independence, Missouri, although their focus has largely shifted westward, and they now think of Utah as Zion, including having a lot of place names called Zion, like Zion National Park. So the modern ideology of Zionism is actually more recent than those Latter-day Saint ideas, and so it dates to the end of the 19th century, in keeping with contemporary European ideas really about ethnic nationalism. European Jewish thinkers proposed the creation of a state for the Jewish nation. So nation being a ethnic, religious group, which would then serve also as a refuge against all of the anti-Semitic persecutions and pogroms that were taking place in Christian societies, predominantly Christian societies of Europe. So it's fully rooted in the idea then of nationalism, this idea of creating a nation state for a nation, but it also comes from that same 19th century time period when with the ideas that are of colonialism and imperialism that existed. And so Jewish settlers, largely from Europe, although also eventually from the different states of the Muslim world, came to Palestine, where they founded colonies like the American colony, but just outside of that, Tel Aviv became one of the main colony. And again, the idea was not to integrate and to live side by side in Jaffa or something like that, but to instead build a new colony that has a European-style city to be the center of a nation state. So decisions to promote Jewish immigration and also eventually to create a Jewish state were made by the imperial powers. So imperialism was also a part of this. So the French and the British at the end of World War I carved up the Ottoman Empire with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and Palestine and Iraq, including Jordan, found themselves in the British sphere, while Syria and Lebanon were in the French sphere, but both empires favored Jewish immigration to Palestine. And again, we went through all that in the different declarations and so on. Very little thought or input was given for the indigenous people that were already there. The input of Christian Zionists continues really to this day. So there are all sorts of Christians, especially in North America and the United States, and in also even some members of my church today, but fewer, who are literalists, who believe that literal millennialists, who believe that the end of the world is coming, and they would still believe that there will be a restoration, that the state of Israel, its establishment, was a first step for that. And many actually date their different countdowns to Armageddon often from 1948 because of the importance of that in their dispensationalist ideas. And these groups also just go along helping out in any way they might in order to cause such a restoration to happen. And so, for example, evangelical farmers in Texas have been breeding for decades red heifers. So according to Levitical law, red heifers are necessary in order to perform sacrifices at a restored Jewish temple. So if a Jewish temple were to be built in Jerusalem, and again, the goal then of these Christian Zionists is to actually prepare for a literal apocalypse, maybe precipitate one, where they believe in the end all of these Jews that they're helping out will either convert to Christianity or will be killed as part of Armageddon and the end of the world. So it's strange bedfellows in a way at the end with doing that. So finally, I want to talk about apartheid and what it Bantustans and even genocide. So when I was in college, there was kind of worldwide disapproval for the white South African government's policy of denying the majority black population of South Africa a lot of basic rights, the ability to vote, these sort of things. Part of the attempted solution that the white South Africans kind of tried, the government tried, in order to respond to this was to cordon off the majority population into tiny enclave states. In other words, the majority of the people are black, but they're being cordoned into these little states that are not even contiguous with one another, and they essentially exist as enclaves within the vast tan space here that is the white state. And so this obviously didn't represent, anything like kind of freedom and equality or any kind of, legitimate independence. And so these were rightly criticized as creating, phony states, or which are called Bantustans, which is to say people who are African ethnic groups like Bantus in stands, like a land for the blacks within the black original population within colonial South Africa. And so the Israeli occupation of the West Bank has been described by many, many groups as a Bantustan, including, for example, South African leaders, the ecumenical organization, the South African Council of Churches continues to tour Palestine in order to speak out against cordoning Palestinians into smaller and smaller ethnic enclaves, which are where they are denied freedom of motion between one another and any capacity to be self-governing. And so, as you can kind of see here again, the Palestinian settlements and towns, or all of the towns and villages, are all the dark brown. There's further lands in the lighter brown, and then all of the purple is controlled by the Israeli government. And specifically between East Jerusalem, here you can see in the blow-up map, and Jericho, a huge settlement has been made with the goal of cutting the West Bank into two, so that it's going to be completed, is that people in the north won't even be able to go to the south the same way that people in Gaza can't go to the West Bank. And so, the settlements here that are ongoing and constantly being built, we often say Israel has a right to defend itself, of course. But settlements have no defensive purpose at all. These are simply aggressions. They also, like I say, are a violation of the Geneva Convention. It's a war crime for transferring your population, seizing the land of a population that's under military occupation, and transferring your own population into it. And so, unfortunately, this is the reality that the Palestinians in the West Bank are facing, and the destruction in Gaza is something else entirety, another order of magnitude. So with over 100,000, I guess, if you add up all of the dead directly killed from by the Israeli military, and then also those in the human-made famine. So if this doesn't qualify as an attempt at ethnically cleansing a territory or of genocide, it's hard to say what would qualify. So what's the way forward? We are very far away at this point from, I think, a peaceful solution at all. And unfortunately, the ongoing reality of all of the Israeli road building and settlements and so forth all through Palestine in the West Bank have also caused the Palestinians there to despair of any potential for even having a two-state solution. In order to actually have two states side by side, all of those illegal settlements would have to be evacuated and returned, the land returned to Palestinians. Otherwise, the state would be just a Bantustan. So there was nothing legitimate. And so, in absence of that, if that's not going to happen, then the only possibility forward is a one-state solution. If it's going to be a democracy, then all of the Palestinians and all of the Israelis would have to be in that state together somehow. Anyway, so that is again still very, very far off. But as we are contemplating that, as I've gone around, like I say, and visited with Israeli activists who want to be partners for peace, as I've talked to leaders of NGOs that are doing their little bit in part to try to make bad situations less terrible in very inspiring ways. This is the place where I feel like we are, and we're hopefully doing what we can to plant seeds for some kind of peace and just future that is still nevertheless quite far off. Okay, and so I'm going to get a glass of water, and Leandro can start seeing if any of you had any comments or questions, or maybe you probably just...
No questions.
Probably no questions, right? So, oh, good. Well, okay, good. All right. Well, first off, I want to thank people for your donations, for your support. We really appreciate all of those. So I want to thank JM and Dartharama and Daryl Scott and Phil and Phil again.
It's the Holy Spirit, says Phil.
Oh, very good, Phil. Thank you. And Medjay Mike and Mark Long and Wayne's World of Science and Technology and JH and Nick C. Thanks, all of you, for all of that support. We really appreciate that. Fastball Flakes said, I've read very briefly about the three-state solution. Is that the most pie-in-the-sky solution to solve the problem? So it's possible. I mean, so I talked to an Israeli official who is a former ambassador to the United States, and he was talking about there are different kinds of possibilities. So the problem here with trying to base a solution on maintaining, let's say, an ethnic Jewish state is that there are roughly in the land of Israel, Palestine, there's roughly as you add it over up, 7 million people who are Jewish Israelis, and then there are about 7 million Palestinians in the land between Palestinian Israelis, East Jerusalem residents, people in the West Bank, and people in Gaza. And so one possibility, of, like you're saying, a multi-state solution is a kind of federation, right, where you are looking at sort of the way Bosnia operates, where and that's a three-state solution, where you have or I guess it's two-state. You have the Serb Republic, and then the Bosnian Croat Republic. within the state, the overall federal state that has sort of a federal control. So those are there are different possibilities. I think that right now the actual infrastructure issue is pretty severe as the building keeps on going on. So the building connects Israeli settlements to each other and cuts off Palestinian towns and cordons them off into essentially into little isolated places. And so there would have to be a lot of changes made in order to reintegrate things somehow. Josh Bedford, I view Christian Zionism to be the worst combination of Christian naive idealism and Israeli realpolitik. Thoughts on this? Yeah. I mean, I think that there's something to be said all the way back for Mark Twain's characterization of Americans as innocents abroad. So the idea is that you have these very kind of naive, pie-in-the-sky, Bible-based, but again, literalist, and not doesn't make any sense if you actually knew the biblical history, kind of idealism, and then and that animates you, and then you have a lot of time and money on your hands to do stuff, and then, as you say, in terms of realpolitik, there's there's interest in the state of Israel to harness that interest and wealth and tourist dollars and just donations and so on, and just general support, political and military support. And so I think that's happened. I think that, but I also think that it's like a short-term realpolitik, and by short-term I think of short-term as a historian. So I'm looking at the state of Israel, which so far has only existed about half the time that the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem existed. And so, in the short term, maybe you're making a deal with this kind of scorpion of the evangelicals or whatever. But they actually, in a lot of cases, that coalition is not entirely all philo-Semitic. Some of them are anti-Semitic. And a lot of them, their Armageddon expectations are that that Jews will be destroyed or converted, and so, which is not a particularly happy scenario. And I would just say that in the same way that my entire lifetime in the U.S., the Republican coalition, their number one thing was that they were opposed to Russia and Russians and Russian imperialism in the form of the Soviet Union. And now suddenly that coalition has turned on a dime, and its leader, has ready to always to cozy up to Vladimir Putin, which is just a kind of a crazy reversal. And so if you can imagine that could happen so rapidly, which was, I would have said, it was unimaginable 20 years ago or 15 years ago even, how much more imaginable is it that a group of people that in some cases includes a coalition of people who are, Trump has actually had dinner with Nazis, actual Nazis. In other words, that there are actual very serious anti-Semites, that coalition also couldn't flip. So I don't think that it's in the state of Israel's long-term interests at all to be playing that kind of realpolitik. And I think that ultimately there's a potential to lose a lot of serious potential in the current activities in Gaza to lose a lot of, let's say, mainstream Western support that had been built up because of the sentiment and sorrow over the outrage over the Holocaust, which is now receding in memory. Jeremy says, what is the Catholic Church's official position on Zionism, if it has one? I don't know it offhand, but I don't think that the Catholic Church is in favor. I think that a lot of this has come from, especially from Protestant churches. So the Catholic Church, there's a lot of Catholics a lot of Palestinian Catholics. There's a lot of Catholics in the Holy Land, and the Catholic Church continues to be a major landowner there. The Orthodox Church is, I think, the biggest landowner, but they're both major landowners with, again, existing members, and so therefore they, it's not as much like like say people who aren't there, like innocents abroad or whatever, Americans that are coming from far away without knowing, without having lived experience there of generational church members that go back for thousands of years living in the land. So I don't think that they're in favor. I mean, they've been in favor, I'm sure, of the ideology of it. But obviously they have good relations, I'm sure, with the state of Israel, but are also concerned about the military. You'll have to look it up on Catholics. I'm just assuming there what the Catholic Church has said. I think the Pope has condemned, atrocities and so forth. You don't know. Okay, we're speculating. So.
No, I think they rejected it.
They rejected it. So that's what Leandro says. I've always had the impression Christian Zionism is mainly an evangelical thing. Clearly not historically, but is that mainly true now? So there was so it was mainly evangelical historically too, but it was like the Protestants and the Puritans. There's also a coming out of that pietism and things like that, evangelicalism emerges out of some of those same roots. And then that has continued to be an evangelical thing, like you say. Apparently, in the first half of the 20th century, especially, it was a pretty mainline Christian thing in the United States, mainline Protestant thing, because of mainline Protestants were especially concerned about, again, the plight of Jews in Europe, and so they were seeing the idea of Zionism and a Jewish homeland in Palestine as, to forgive the analogy, as sort of like the same American idea of a homeland in Africa for freed slaves, Liberia, right? And so they almost had the same idea of it, and so there is let's say a thoughtful component of it that is thoughtful of the Jews, but again, not thinking of the people who actually live in the land. Daryl Scott says, I've talked to several people who say that Palestinians simply don't belong on land that was given to the Jews by God. What do you think is the best response to that? So that's, that's a let's say potential partisan religious interpretation of whatever the person's individual religion is. That, though, has no basis, let's say, in international law. So ownership of land or title to land is not based on interpretation of ancient religious claims. It's based on who has been there for the last while, and so the fact that again, the Palestinians have a continuity of being the people that were living there all the way up, through especially the last few centuries, is what counts. I can trace my ancestry and find where my ancestors, even houses that they were living in the Middle Ages. That doesn't mean I own them, because that's not how property works. They left at some point, or other they moved, or some other heir took over that house, as opposed to, or sold it or bought it, and so forth. So what I would say to that religious claim is, this is if it is something that God wants, then we can let God be doing that. In other words, if God is going to cause the world to end in some kind of literal way and give land to somebody, then we can wait for God to do that, as opposed to acting in ways that contravene international law, war crimes, and that kind of thing. Parasocial audience says, any relationship between the 19th century son of Shem / rapture theology and black Hebrew Israelite settlement of the Caribbean and South America and Europe and Mormon white tribesmen in America. There's a lot of different groups and things like that and threads to try to draw together. I guess the connection that we might make between kind of all of those things, like rapture theology, which is also, as you mentioned, is kind of it's not a historic idea that's within Christianity, but it's a modern idea that people have had. Same thing with, like you're saying, the curse of Cain and those kind of things. That these are, this is coming from people who are taking the Bible literally. They are having a focus on it that is absolute and kind of total in a way that Christians had never had before. But simultaneously, the people that are reading it are just commoners who are not particularly well trained theologically, and certainly they don't have the historical basis that we now have with the continued development of academic history. So what I'll say is that the thread that probably ties that all together is people are reading Bible stories, they interpret them literally, they want to see themselves in them, and they are also, interpreting them in the context of their world at the time, the 19th century, whether they are in Europe or in the Mormon West or in the Caribbean or South America and so forth. Can we scroll down, Leandro?
Yes. What was the last question you read?
As parasocial audience. K. Tempest Bradford says, churches, church groups, and faith groups should work together toward peace, though I wonder if it's more imperative for them to do so in this conflict versus others, given the Abrahamic connections. Yeah, I guess I kind of felt like it is more important or more imperative as a church to be involved, and this is one of the reasons why, when I committed to going on this trip and things kept on not getting better, and in fact, Netanyahu started actually attacking Lebanon and other countries, and so it seemed like it was it's only expanded, and people were sort of saying, why are you going to go on this? It's crazy. But I also feel like, and continue to feel like, that this is something that, as a Christian pastor whose church has, some small part in this story. So, descendants of the people in that Jaffa colony, including close friends of mine in the church, that we have the responsibility to not just delete that from our history, but to work for peace, so that people in the Middle East, whether it's Jews and Muslims and Christians and people who are not adherent of any religion, so atheists and so on, so that they can enjoy at some point, fundamental human rights, live in dignity and in justice and so forth. And so maybe this one, as a place that we have lectures on this topic pretty frequently that are paced in that land or in kind of those historic time frame. And so I guess I'm feeling more connected to this particular global conflict hotspot than I am to, for example, all of the horrible things that are going on in Burma and Myanmar, which is also very terrible, but that maybe I'm less connected to and feel maybe less personal responsibility for, although I'm also in favor of, human rights for everybody and no ethnic cleansing, opposing ethnic cleansing wherever it's happening. Nadav Kravitz says, a word conspicuously absent from the list was fascism. Is there a case to be made that Israel is in some ways fascistic? So, possibly, yes. People had, while I was there, there were some actually Israelis who were making that case. So we were talking to, among the different guides that we had, and just individuals that we met are Israelis who are descendants from early 20th century Zionists who were secular Jews and who've continued to have that kind of secular tradition, who wanted to be partners of peace with the Palestinians, but feel that their government has now, kind of pushed off into this direction that is where that's very far away indeed. And certainly, one of the components of it, I think the components of fascism include like a lot of militarism of the society, and the society is very militarized. So they are in a rough neighborhood. Everybody serves in the military, except for the ultra-religious. When I got to go to the Wailing Wall, which is the holiest Jewish site, it was entirely taken over by a young military regiment that was doing their sort of a nationalistic kind of ritual there, and kind of as they were finishing basic training, and so you could kind of see where, and that was similarly happened. We saw school kids when we were at Masada, which has become kind of a one of these national identity spots, as it's part of this kind of identity formation that I was talking about with like Scotland and Braveheart. Masada kind of is feeling that same kind of national identity role as a site, and so those were all very apparent. And so many of these Israeli activists that we met with didn't feel very hopeful in terms of where that original vision that they feel like their grandparents had when they came as refugees from Europe and established, like a socialist kibbutzes and that kind of a thing. J.H. Joseph, thank you so much for your support. Joseph says, is there a growing racist movement belief that not all Jews have equal rights to the land following the distorted idea of Levites that I know of? I'm not aware of that focusing around Levites, so I'm not sure. There was always a bunch of discrimination within Israel between the Jews that had come from Europe and the Jews that had come from the Arab world, where the latter were poorer and given worse jobs and so on initially. I think that there's been some improvement in that, according to the Israelis that I talked to, who are largely descendants of the European Jews. It may be that that part of this is also the growing divide between the kind of secular old-time Israel and the new and rapidly growing ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Israel, where ultra-Orthodox don't necessarily consider other non-Orthodox Jews to be real Jews, maybe, or like the Reform Judaism, for example, doesn't qualify because it's different from their interpretation, their ultra-Orthodox interpretation. Istvan Jamrik says, question to John, do you know where the Utah LDS Church stands as far as Zionism goes? So I know that the Utah LDS Church has a large facility in East Jerusalem, the BYU Jerusalem Center, and I think in general it's way less reformed in terms of it. I think that even though it's not immediately in the future for most Mormons or most members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they're literalist millennialists, so they do believe in a literal end of the world, and they continue to, I think, have a general belief that there'll be a restoration of all things, and that maybe certainly an early apostle traveled all the way to the Ottoman Empire and set apart the land there for the establishment of a Judean state, and that's seen, I think, in 1948 as a fulfillment of that that intervention and that kind of prophecy. And so I think that in general, they have been kind of proponents of a kind of a proto-Zionism, a pre-Zionism that existed before Zionism, so restorationism, and have probably continued to the present as getting along pretty well with Israelis or Israeli officials. All right, so that is it. Thank you, guys. This was a fraught topic, and thank you for largely keeping it cordial as we've tried to treat this topic fairly, and also just to kind of share observations and conversations that I had on this really remarkable but also kind of troubling trip that I was able to take with Churches for Middle East Peace. We will have a lecture next week, but I don't know what it is yet, so I'm a little bit behind, but we will announce it and look forward to seeing you then.